All right, hi everyone. Phil Travis here, your professor here at EOU. This presentation is second half of the Civil War, the war itself, 1863 to 1865, a total war of attrition. So the war, particularly in the last 2 years, becomes increasingly dominated by the naval war, at least the realities inside the Confederacy. And what I mean by that is the naval war, the naval blockade of the South by 63, 64, and of course 65 really increasingly came to damage the Southern economy and of course the supply of the Southern soldiers. The blockade, of course, was very difficult. In this cartoon, it's a political cartoon. Here it depicts Winfield Scott's depicts it depicts Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan. It's obviously an artistic rendition of the plan to use a blockade to surround the South, cut them off, undermine their economy, undermine the ability of them to make war, and use that as a way to ultimately bring them to their knees and surrender. The U.S. had a very small, the Union or the United States had a very small navy at the outset of the war. Over time, though, we do build up a very large navy, and we had 150 to 200 boats patrolling the coast at any particular time by this period of the war. However, it's a very difficult thing to enforce. It's a huge effort. The coastline we're talking about is over 3,000 miles. There's also, control of the Mississippi River. It's a big deal, and it's a hard thing to do, but it was becoming increasingly effective in the latter period of the war. Now, the Confederacy's response to the Union blockade they really have to be innovative. They have to use innovative technology to try to break the blockade, to try to nullify the blockade. One of these was the uses of ironclads. Pictured here is the CSS Virginia. Some ironclads had iron hulls. Lots of ironclads were wooden ships that were fitted out with iron plates. The ironclad was designed to be used to break blockades held by less fortified wooden ships. And of course, the CSS Virginia had sunk a couple of ships in its inaugural missions in the Chesapeake Bay area, trying to break the blockade. Of course, the Union built ironclads too, and the USS Monitor, one of the most famous, but they built ironclads too and ultimately built more of them than the South, and so it kind of nullified that advantage they were trying to get. Another example, of course, is the submarine, the CSS Hunley. What you're looking at here actually is not a submarine. This is a commerce raider. I'll show you an image of the Hunley in just a second. But submarines like the CSS Hunley, which was basically an early rudimentary submarine, and it did sink a boat, the Housatonic, though it did sink itself in the mission, but it did nonetheless sink a boat in Charleston Harbor before itself sinking. And the Hunley has been raised, by the way. And if you are ever happen in Charleston, when you go down there through 26 and down by Charleston, you can see the signs for the Hunley, and you can go see the Hunley. There are also the Confederates used what they called torpedoes, but they're really naval mines that they would put in harbors to try to make it more difficult for Union forces to take ports. They also used commerce raiders, as you see right here. Commerce raiders, particularly ones built by the British, like the CSS Alabama, the CSS Florida. These boats were very effective, and they were designed to attack Union merchant vessels. And actually, they were pretty effective in attacking Union merchant vessels. But the problem was that the Union relied increasingly on trade from foreign vessels, from both the British and other foreign European powers. And of course, the South made sure not to attack those ships, especially as it was increasingly hoping that maybe it could get international cooperation. This is a drawing of the Hunley. It wasn't a big craft, but you can see it definitely has the shape of a submarine, of an early era submarine. This is the boat that it sunk, steamer that it sank in Charleston Harbor before itself actually sinking. This is an image, well, not an image, it's a painting, obviously, of the Battle of Mobile Bay, and I like this because it shows, the technologies, the two technologies kind of coming in together, where you see ironclad steamers. These are steam-powered vessels, ironclad vessels fighting steam-powered wooden ships. You can kind of see masted vessels there coming up against these steam-powered ironclads. This new technology, this technology of the future in some respects of naval warfare. Civil War soldiers had, a hard life. It was a little bit harder for a Confederate soldier than it was for a Union soldier, and that had a lot to do with the blockade. That had a lot to do with the decreasing amount of supplies that were enjoyed by the Confederacy as the blockade damaged their economy and made it more and more difficult for them to supply their troops. Rations were provided to troops. Union troops ate a little bit better overall. Confederate troops and Union troops both had a bread or a carb ration. Confederate troops had something called Johnny Cakes, based on cornmeal. The Union troops had hardtack, which was a very tough, like square bread flour thing that you didn't want to get wet because it would get bugs and stuff in it. They also had salted meats. Salted meats were salted so much that they were almost uneatable. Soldiers drank a lot of coffee during the war. Soldiers cooked too in camps. When they were in camp, and of course a soldier spends way more time in camp than they do in battle. And so they had to forage the land, find vegetables and these types of things, and they cooked for themselves. They spent a lot of time in camps. They spent a lot of time marching and drilling and these types of things. But of course, no amount of drill could ever prepare you for the realities of battle. Battle during the Civil War was more intense and thoroughgoing in terms of death and violence than any other conflict before. Major battles like Gettysburg could last several days. Battlefields at the end were strewn with bodies. There was death all around. Officers did not lead from afar. Officers led by example, and they had to give commands while in the heat of battle. They had to prevent their troops from breaking amid pressure, despite intense violence, smoke, incredible artillery fire, poor visibility, all of these types of things. And in these types of battles, which could become very intense, even the most well experienced unit could sometimes break and flee the battlefield. And the officer's job was also to help them to reconsolidate themselves when they did this, and not to break ranks. Battlefields had stenches of smoke, of gunpowder, the smell of human excrement that sometimes occurs in these incredible, frightful situations. Fear, death, noise, and this incredibly violent type of conflict on a scale never really seen before. Inspired desertions on both sides, though desertions were at a minimal for both sides. The relative number is about the same percentage-wise. And so the reason that many soldiers didn't desert, of course, would have been that camaraderie, that feeling of brotherhood, and not letting your compatriots down. But the Civil War battlefield was particularly challenging and particularly difficult and particularly deadly. It was not uncommon for battles to result in thousands of dead, which was something that that was just not experienced with regularity before this kind of new industrial war. Here you see Union soldiers with General George Meade. These are Union officers. These are all high command. I just wanted to show you an image of what an officer's tent looked like. Get an image of officers around camp. This is a painting of the Battle of Chickamauga, and I wanted to show you this because it just kind of gets you a feel for some of the violence on the battlefield, the smoke, relatively close quarters fighting, these types of things. And obviously it's an artistic description, but the battlefields were intense, they were violent, they were deadly, and they were very, very fear-inducing. There was a lot of bloodshed and a lot of death and a lot of very horrid woundings. Medicine during the Civil War was, quite antiquated. There were some painkillers like morphine. Chloroform was also used, though in hard-up situations, a soldier might be asked to bite the bullet. Use alcohol to withstand an amputation. Surgeons often appeared more like butchers. Their gowns were bloodied. There were piles of limbs. If you received a wound of the torso, it was almost a guaranteed death due to infection. Big caliber rounds were used. These are large calibers, and when they hit a bone, they shatter the bone, which results in infection. And this is one of the reasons why amputations were so common. Nearly 20% of the wounded died of infection during this conflict, including Stonewall Jackson. The turning point for the war, and you guys, of course, are reading in depth about this, particularly in your Gettysburg book, which you should be reading part 4. The turning point for the war is in really spring and summer 1863. Basically, the Union adopted a new strategy. Instead of trying to capture the capital of Richmond, the goal was to destroy Lee's army. Lee's army was really the sole most important factor in the rallying of the South in the war. And so they really started to aim at Lee. And the first attempt to do so was in May of 1863 at the Battle of Chancellorsville, in which Lee went up against General Hooker, Fighting Joe Hooker. Lee again wins a brilliant victory at Chancellorsville. And he was aggressive, and he took a big chance, and he, again, being a great general, he was one step ahead in the thinking of his enemy. He understood his opponent, and he knew his opponent would react in a particular way. And Lee was very successful for that. However, at Chancellorsville, Stonewall Jackson was shot, and he ultimately dies later that month. But after the battle, nonetheless, Lee, he sensed an opportunity to again invade the North and again take one last shot at trying to win a major victory on Northern soil and encourage a treaty that would recognize the South. And of course, that operation results in the Battle of Gettysburg, which was fought on July 1st through 3rd, 1863. It was the last chance for really a victory that could gain a treaty. Pictured here, you see General George Meade and Robert E. Lee. Meade, the Union general, in the battle. Lee, actually, this is one of the first times Lee, and possibly out of desperation, possibly out of knowing that that he really had to win this battle. This was the one chance. Some of Lee's, soldiers, their shoes were worn out. They were in dire need for supplies. The blockade was beginning to affect the troops in the army, and Lee knew that the time was nigh if they were going to have a treaty, if they were going to be able to achieve this. And so Lee, for once, actually made an error. He was tricked by the artillery of Meade's forces, who hid their artillery further back, causing Lee's artillery to fall inaccurately and not affect it. Furthermore, after Lee had begun his artillery barrage during the battle, the Union artillery commander purposely stopped firing as he hid his artillery pieces down behind this little hill, and this caused Lee to think that he had silenced the guns effectively. It was a mistake, obviously, and as the battle progresses, the Union artillery will return to action and take a decimating toll on the Confederate soldiers. Of course, also Lee launched Pickett's Charge, the frontal assault up against the Union forces on Cemetery Ridge. They had to advance across 3/4 of a mile area, and it was a very, very risky maneuver. And Lee probably again was banking on his opponent not being up to fending off that kind of aggressive action, but he was wrong in this case, of course, and Pickett's Charge was a failure. The Union fought very well, I think, in the Civil War in general, but Gettysburg was in some ways, the finest hour for some of the Union fighters. A young George Armstrong Custer won an impressive cavalry battle nearby that also played a significant factor in the Union success. And this was a key factor. Once Lee was forced to retreat back into Virginia, it was really a matter of time. And coupling this with Ulysses S. Grant's success at Vicksburg, which he had failed at Vicksburg previously, and he finally succeeded simultaneously, almost on the exact same day as the Gettysburg success. Vicksburg fell to Grant, and Vicksburg was the last Southern stronghold on the Mississippi River. And so when this happened, it really sealed the fate for the South. It sealed the fate in the sense that the South now was probably going to lose slowly rather than be able to achieve that kind of big victory that could perhaps bring about a treaty that was in their interest. And so as a result of that, this moment in the spring and summer of 1863, from a great victory for Lee, but one that cost him probably his best commander in Stonewall Jackson, to the defeat at Gettysburg and the Confederate defeat at Vicksburg, it ultimately becomes a period. It is the turning point. So, a war of attrition refers to, of course, a conflict in which the victor is determined largely by which one can maintain their ability to make war the longest, who can throw the most into the fight. The war becomes truly, after Gettysburg, a war of attrition. The Union strategy moves to effectively waging war on all fronts. They're going to fight. They're going to focus on not only taking and destroying the Army of Northern Virginia, which is still a key strategy, but also on fighting Southern forces throughout the Confederacy, and of course attacking supplies and resources from within the Confederacy. During this period, Ulysses S. Grant is given it's not unprecedented because George Washington had it, but the rank of Lieutenant General. Only George Washington had held that rank before. And Grant leads an operation to destroy the Army of Northern Virginia, which began with Grant's campaigns in the Virginia wilderness and then the siege at Petersburg. They're engaging the entirety of the Southern armies simultaneously, and of course, with Sherman's march to the sea, depriving the Confederacy of the ability to to make war. Of course, Sherman's March to the Sea is an incredibly devastating and controversial aspect of this kind of campaign of total war, particularly in South Carolina, where in South Carolina, Columbia was burned to the ground. We'll never know exactly how that fire started, and both sides blamed each other, but the city was burned to the ground. In South Carolina, there were many towns that were destroyed. Georgia was not as hard hit, though there were many civilian elements that were destroyed in Atlanta, as effectively Sherman's troops went on a 60-mile wide continuous raid throughout the region. And the idea, William Tecumseh Sherman's troops, the idea was that they would deny the Confederacy key resources for feeding and supplying their troops. And Sherman had told them in many occasions to avoid destroying and avoid attacking or killing civilians or destroying civilian property that wasn't inherent for war effort. But of course, there was much that happened in that respect. By and large, throughout the war, though, I mean, the Union had been very good at trying to avoid civilian casualties and trying to avoid targeting civilian areas. But by 1864, the war has really become a war of attrition, a total war, and that means fighting in the most extreme way to deprive the enemy of any ability to wage the war. And that meant cutting them up on the inside, defeating the Army of Northern Virginia, and blockading them around their ports. This map shows you kind of the dwindling scope of the Confederacy. You can see the shaded areas that depict Sherman's march to the sea through Georgia. You can see the areas that depict the loss of area around Richmond and by Petersburg, where Petersburg was sieged. Lee ultimately surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, the McLean House, on April 9th, 1865. Lee had been in Petersburg after being pushed away from the Wilderness Campaign. Lee is in Petersburg. Grant surrounds Petersburg and is sieging Petersburg. Lee ultimately is forced out of Petersburg, and he flees to the west of Virginia, and he was hoping to get down and be able to turn and go down south into North Carolina, where he could meet up with other Southern forces to combine their forces and concentrate their defensive efforts further south. But as you can see depicted in the blue lines, the Northern armies consistently made that impossible for Lee to do, and they pursued Lee until Appomattox, and at Appomattox, Lee accepts, Lee accepts Grant's terms of surrender. Ulysses S. Grant pictured here, and of course Robert E. Lee. Grant's terms of surrender were quite gracious. He allowed Confederate soldiers to return home. He allowed officers to, obviously soldiers had to turn in their arms, though he allowed officers to keep their sidearms. He allowed them to take their horses. Confederate forces were saluted by the Union forces as Grant signs this surrender, and the defeat of the Army of Northern Virginia really marked the end of the war. Of course, shortly thereafter, Lincoln would be assassinated. There was some intent from Jefferson Davis to continue to try to struggle, but the war was really over after Lee surrenders on April 9th, 1865. And of course, Lincoln will be assassinated several days later, and the United States will descend into the difficult period of Reconstruction. So I hope this is helpful, guys. I hope this kind of, helps us think a little bit about the Civil War. The Civil War was a devastating conflict for Americans. Americans lost more people in this war than any other conflict. Um, Accepted estimates are 620,000. Some estimates have gone up to over 700,000 of Americans killed. Not to mention the thousands and thousands of Americans who were maimed, who suffered amputations, which was something like, I think it was like 18%, I believe it is, suffered amputations. It's a devastating war. And the shock of this war to the American people is we've continued to have to deal with the tragedy of this war in coming decades, and we still today live with some of the influence of the Civil War in the United States. So it's a devastating war that cost a tremendous amount of lives, and for a military history class, it's a war that is really embodied as it's an industrial war of attrition. Industrial warfare meant massive killing on a scale that was really unprecedented. And when you look at World War I, you see it go to even another level. But the Civil War really was a total industrial war with massive human consequences. Anyway, I hope this is helpful, guys. Let me know if you have any questions.